Watch and the Water Integrity Network are launching a report titled Money Down the Drain.
The report looks at corruption in South Africa's water sector. It's currently taking place, as you can see on your screen. Let's go there now live.
The white economy, and only a trickle to black areas, was profoundly corrupt. We need to understand that. We also need to understand that post-94 there was a huge pressure to suddenly provide services to the unserved millions of South Africa. That meant huge investment, huge money, huge infrastructure development. It also meant that we needed to bring people into the system who had been excluded from the system. In the process, inadvertently, a whole lot of doors also got opened for corruption. So let's just take that as a framing and recognize that that's the history that we come out of. I also want to say that, as Dave said, a lot of what we are putting on the table, we haven't gone and done sort of primary research. A lot of the information in this report has come out of work done by the media, the civil society, and government structures, in particularly the Auditor General, who have done some very useful investigations that have come out with some very useful results. So thank you very much to those who've done a whole lot of homework over years in order to inform what we have here. And I think, just to reiterate what Dave was saying, we need to recognize that corruption is profoundly affecting the water security of the country. And the water security of the country profoundly affects our economic future, but it's also profoundly affecting the day-to-day experience of households. You know, if you don't have electricity, well, you can light a candle, or you can light a paraffin lamp or a paraffin stove. If you don't have clean and safe drinking water, particularly in a country where we have a lot of people with compromised immune systems, people actually get ill and ultimately people die. So we have a human right to water in our constitution. Corruption is undermining it, is violating the delivery of that human right, and we have to tackle corruption from that perspective. Just to say also that the water sector is very vulnerable to corruption, not least because it's a sector that is technically complex. There are large-scale infrastructure projects. Globally, infrastructure and construction is known to be a sector that is vulnerable to corruption. It needs high levels of investment, and very often it's operating almost as a monopoly in a particular area. We also have the situation, particularly in South Africa, where water is a finite and scarce resource. Competition for water is very high. So there are risks relating to how it's managed and how it's allocated. There are a number of institutions that need to be regulated. So we've got, how many municipalities, water services providers do we have in this country? 180 something? We have water boards, we have the department, all of which need to be regulated. But ultimately, this sector is particularly important because it is a human right and because it is a life and death issue. And that's why we need to take it on. So let's go into some of the examples, and you're all going to go home and read the report in great detail. And I can't go through all of the examples, and I can't go through even the examples in great detail, otherwise we'll still be here this afternoon. But let's start with the Giyani water project, which is probably the one that I would imagine that most people know fairly well what I'm talking about when I talk about this. This was the notion of taking... In 2009, there were issues of delivery of water in Giyani and the surrounding villages. There was a drought. The drought was used as the motivation for the development of a pipeline to provide water from the Ndoli Dam to Giyani. In 2009, it was a 247 million rand project. There was a whole lot of shenanigans that happened over the various time. But let's just say that by 2009, 2.5 billion had been spent. The department said that 10 billion was still required to complete the project. And the Auditor General's report is that of the 2.5 spent, 2.2 billion was irregular expenditure. And we will come back to the notion of irregular expenditure as a red flag for corruption. Okay, so that was the Giyani project, and the details of all of these projects, all of these examples are in the report. That's the infrastructure side. Let's talk about IT. It's another area where globally, I'm afraid, there's huge corruption risks. The Department of Water and Sanitation put in place a 5-year contract for close on R1 billion for software services from SAP. Despite the fact that the department already had unlimited licenses from SAP, neither the department's water trading entity, which is the infrastructure side of things, nor the water boards that were apparently going to be given these licenses had been consulted. There was advice from the CETA and from the CFO of the department not to do this. The money was not available, and yet it went ahead, and once again ruled by the Auditor General to be irregular expenditure. Clanwilliam Dam. Clanwilliam Dam, the opportunity exists to raise Clanwilliam Dam. Raising the dam will increase the yield by about 40% and has the potential to increase agriculture in the area and create in the region of 4,000 agricultural jobs in a country that is desperate for jobs. The project started in 2015, and the department has an internal infrastructure and construction branch, and they were going to do this. They started on it, and it was going to be an excellent chance for actually training up new people on a construction project, etc., until it was stopped by Minister Mokonyane, who then said it was going to be done by external contractors. And some fairly familiar names were mentioned about who the external contractors were going to be. Fortunately, Minister Nkwinti intervened and stopped that, and it went back to being an internal in-house project. Moving to the municipal level, because this is by no means only the department. This goes from the top right the way down. Let's look at Nelson Mandela Bay. Challenges around water supply. They had the potential for a pipeline, a 40-kilometre pipeline, to provide Orange River water to the necessary treatment works. But there was a group of people who were trying to, municipal officials and promoters, who wanted to promote a desalination plant. Infinitely more expensive. One has to ask, why was there a intention to promote something that was going to be much more expensive than a simpler and cheaper option? And that's, again, where the red flags for corruption immediately start going. Because one of the things we know in the corruption sector is that it drives things towards much more expensive options. Because quite simply, if you have a chance of a 10% payoff on a R1 billion project, it's much nicer than a 10% payoff on a R1 million project. So corruption drives things towards inappropriate infrastructure. The tussle that was happening in Nelson Mandela Bay between the two options actually meant that any kind of development got postponed until actually the drought hit. And at the time that everybody was focused on Cape Town and go, oh, day zero in Cape Town, Nelson Mandela Bay was facing exactly the same problems and trying to reduce their water use. The drought caused job losses in industry and agriculture and was, as a direct result of decisions not having been taken in time, because there were people who were trying to push inappropriate decisions in the area. Then let's go to the issue of tankers and toilets. And there's a quote here from Nkaniso Msomi in eThekwini, but this quote could come from municipalities all over the country. We hear that officials are cutting our water supply so that we will get water delivered by tankers. We hear that the officials are benefiting from the water tankers. There's a number of municipalities in which those allegations have been made, where the allegations being made of active sabotage by municipal officials, or by people connected to municipal officials, so that people who own tankers can get the contract to tanker in water and make a pot of money out of the municipality renting those paying for those tankers. Let me also say that I mean, one of the challenges of that is that tanker supply is A, intermittent, and B, there's very often very poor control over where those tankers are collecting their water and what the quality is of the water that is being provided to people. So there are a number of areas in which the tankering in of water is a problem. Then on the toilet side, we look at Ekurhuleni, that for some reason cancelled a contract that was already in place for the provision of toilets and informal settlements, and put it out to a whole number of small-scale providers, some of whom did not actually have the capacity to provide toilets. So what they did was they then subcontracted to the people who had been providing the toilets. Again, red flags that get raised. Sorry. How do I go up a page again? So essentially, if we're looking at the kind of strategies that are being used for corruption, in our analysis, they fall into three kind of major boxes. And the one is the manipulation of procurement and operational processes. The other is around trying to influence policy and regulatory decisions. And the other one is actually taking control of the decision-making sites and institutions. And I'm going to look at some of these, but again, I can't possibly go through all of the different strategies that are. So I'm going to give you a flavour, a nouveau cuisine taste of it, and you can read the document for the details. One of the challenges is that tender processes can be rigged, even in a well-run system, if there are enough people who are happy to influence the process. So no matter what requirements you have in place about this has to be done and this has to be done and this has to be done, if you have people who are willing to buck the system, and if there is no impunity, and we will come back to that, it can really still, no matter what's on paper, it can go awry. So when we're looking, for example, at provisions, there are special provisions in this country for large infrastructure. It requires a separate bid specification committee, bid evaluation committee, and bid adjudication committee. On the basis that that means no one group of people can take the thing. You have checks and balances of separate people looking at the process at separate times. But if you have somebody at the top of that who goes, well, I don't care what came out of those committees, actually the process becomes irrelevant. So in Mpumalanga, for example, there was a situation where a tender went out. There was a late circulation of an amendment to the tender, which meant that only one bid actually met the tender specifications. That in itself is a whole strategy for actually getting past the tender system. The bid evaluation committee actually did their work, and they went, no, the changes in the specifications that went out is not material. So we are not disqualifying people who haven't done that. It's not material. And they went ahead with a proper process, and they recommended a particular company to be appointed. But the CEO went, nah, and changed who was appointed. In that case, it's very difficult unless you have good oversight mechanisms. Your procurement processes can be undermined. So processes are only effective if they are complied with at all levels and if there are consequences for failure to do so. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we're seeing, is that there are not yet sufficient consequences for the failure to adhere to procedures. Other ways that the tender processes get corrupted. There are provisions in the procurement requirements legislation that are designed to enable government to work efficiently under certain circumstances. So one of the things, for example, is that the Treasury regulations allow government departments to set up a panel of service providers. It's intended to enable government departments, if they want toilet paper on a regular basis, to have a list of people that they can get the toilet paper from. It specifies for regular and repeated services, and where the terms of reference can be clearly and simply specified. But it's abused to set up panels of service providers for large-scale infrastructure and to appoint companies to develop and build large-scale infrastructure on the basis of a panel of service providers that was not intended in the original regulations to be used for that purpose. Then there is specific regulations that allow government to bypass tender procedures where, for example, there's an emergency, which is absolutely appropriate. Where there's an emergency, you might need to bring in somebody right now. You can't go through a whole tender procedure, etc. Those emergency procedures get abused either by creating an emergency, for example, through sabotaging a pipeline at municipal level, or creating or declaring an emergency and saying this is an emergency, we bypass the regulations. There's a what's called Regulation 32, which enables government, if another body, organ of state, has properly appointed a contractor or a service provider to provide a service, another organ of state can actually use that for the same service. It's generally called as the piggybacking regulation. But it's being abused. And so where people have been inappropriately appointed, they are getting appointed inappropriately. If the original appointment was inappropriate, any piggybacking of that helps that happens is actually inappropriate, and it's being manipulated for certain people to actually get tenders across more than one municipality, for example, or across more than one organ of state. Then in terms of the water sector specifically, there's a challenge around directives under the Water Services Act. The Water Services Act allows the Minister to give directives to entities under her authority. But those directives need to be reasonable, and they need to be financially viable, and they should be paid for by the department. But in fact, directives have been issued to water boards in particular to carry out things without, for example, the budget following, leaving water boards in a precarious financial state. And there's been considerable abuse of those directives and how they're interpreted and how they are used. One of the things we talk about in the water sector in South Africa is the lack of institutional capacity, the weakness of our institutions. But one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is there a will to have strong institutions, or is there a will to actually have weakened institutions? And in an environment of corruption and systemic corruption, you actually see systematic weakening of institutions and of oversight mechanisms, because that enables corruption to flourish. So then we need to ask ourselves, if between 2009 and 2017, which is the case, the average length of tenure of a DG or acting DG was 11 months, over a period of nearly 10 years, 11 months, less than a year, was that accidental or was that deliberate? Was that part of a process of making sure that nobody who was actually a strong and competent leader with integrity was able to run the department? One of the things that I think is worth noting is that the appointment of DGs is done in consultation with the presidency, but the dismissal of DGs, I think, does not require that kind of oversight. Let me come to a slightly different issue, and those people who've been listening to 702 in the near future would have heard discussions about the construction mafia yesterday or the day before. There is a requirement in the South African construction industry for a proportion of the workforce to come from the local community. It's a perfectly right requirement, but it's being abused. And what one is actually seeing at the moment, that there are demands being put in place. It's essentially almost amounting to protection rackets, and the construction industry in South Africa is extremely concerned that there are construction rackets. Mafias operating, demanding part of the contracts, not necessarily in the interest of the local community, but in the interest of particular groupings at local level. So it's increasingly common that demands are being made for extra allocation of funds to community components without them necessarily being community components. So one of the things that we have been mulling over in this report is that there is a lot of anecdotes and a lot of stuff that points towards a correlation between incidents of large-scale corruption and political activity. Now, we are not forensic investigators. We do not have the resources to go and follow the money down the bank account trails and find out exactly where it comes out. But there is a very serious question that needs to be asked as to whether the corruption in the water sector is being used as a vehicle to fund political activity. So, what do we do about it? We know that corruption in the water sector has damaged people's lives and livelihoods. Resources that should have improved services have gone into private pockets and to consolidate the power of politicians at all levels. The performance of water sector institutions has deteriorated appallingly over the past decade. What can we do to turn this around? And at this point I have to say there are no easy solutions. I wish there was like a silver bullet. We can go, do this and, corruption's gone. Somebody asked me earlier, can one create a situation where there's no corruption? No, I don't believe they can. Can you create a situation where you can actually minimize and control corruption? Absolutely you can. I think we need to recognize that there has already been action. It's not as though nothing is happening in the sector. There are whistleblowers. There are journalists who have reported on a whole lot of this stuff. The Auditor General has done investigations and published some very important reports. And I think we also need to recognize that in a whole lot of these water institutions, there are people, competent and dedicated officials and board members who are trying very hard to do the right thing in very difficult circumstances. And I think what we need to recognize that in an environment of systemic corruption, often doing the right thing is at severe cost to people's mental well-being, their jobs, and sometimes even their lives. And so it's really tough on the people who are trying to do the right thing. The SIU has already been given directives by the President to investigate a whole bunch of allegations of procurement and contract management investigations in the department, in Lepella and Mgeni water boards, in Gauteng Provincial Department of Housing related to water, and in a number of municipalities, for a total estimated amount of around 4 billion rand. They have already taken legal action to terminate some contracts and to recover some funds. They've passed information on to the NPA and the tax authorities to consider criminal investigation. Some departmental officials have resigned, some are facing internal disciplinary action, but actually we haven't seen sufficient consequences yet, serious consequences. And one of the challenges of the presidential proclamations to the SIU is that they do not address the issue of the accountability of the political leadership in what's been going on. There are also, there's stuff that has been done right in South Africa that we can learn from, and we shouldn't get into totally the doom and gloom scenario, because there is some good stuff. So, for example, Joburg Water put in place a management system which not only improved their utility performance, but it made petty corruption more difficult because, essentially, of the system of recording what happens. So the system wouldn't issue materials or tools to any plumbers or foremen unless there was a registered job card. It made it a lot harder for people to lobby for either for priority attention or for illegal, illicit work, because everything had to go through a call center and had to be registered. So the paper trail was or the electronic trail perhaps was there. The other thing is to say that the threat of consequences actually does work. And we will come back to this issue of consequences because it's critical. If we look back in history to the phase 1A of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, there was criminal prosecution of both officials and private companies, with at least one official in Lesotho going to jail, and significant consequences for at least one international engineering company. Phase 1B was completed after that in 2004. It was completed close to its planned time and on budget, and there were some instances of corruption, but there were criminal charges following on from that, and there were fewer cost increases due to contract variations and claims. And one can draw the assumption that actually what happened in Phase 1B made people go, maybe we should behave ourselves on this project. There's also been active action by governance structures. If we look at the Umzimvubu project, the board of TCTA should be commended for actually exercising what is their fiduciary responsibility. There were attempts to promote the funding of this project through some Chinese funding by the minister at the time, and there was in fact explicit instruction from the board to the chief executive to say, do not sign the loan agreement with China, which actually prevented this country from entering into what would have been an incredibly expensive and very problematic project. And that's an example of a board exercising what is its real fiduciary responsibility. Then there's the kind of thing that happens where there's pressure from external institutions. So there was an effort by the minister to amalgamate the Mhlutuzi and Mgeni water boards, which was seen as being problematic because there was a certain chairperson of the Mhlutuzi water board who was then apparently, rumour had it, going to become the chairperson of the merged boards, and there were some challenges, some concerns raised around that. The financial institutions who held Mgeni water board bonds essentially were concerned about the security of their investments, based on the fact that there was no substantive business case for the merger or assessment of the financial consequences, and the message came through from them was very clear. If proper governance is not in place, business will not fund water projects. So that helps to create the environment that says we need proper governance, we need clean governance, otherwise we're not going to be able to go ahead. So now we come to some of the recommendations that we put on the table. And again, I'm not going through absolutely everything. I'm going to highlight some of the critical recommendations that we think might be useful in trying to shift things in the water sector in South Africa at the moment. The first thing is that we have to end impunity. We have to somehow find a way of instilling a culture of consequences. Because where there is no consequence for corruption, major maladministration, whatever it is, it's very difficult to keep it under control. So we need a culture in which misconduct has its consequences. And that's the responsibility of all of the water sector institutions, the Auditor General, the law enforcement authorities, including the SIU. If we saw that what the SIU is involved in at the moment, leading to some real cases and some real orange uniforms for people, maybe it would shift this culture of impunity that exists at the moment. The other thing we're saying is that we need to, the possibility of political corruption should always be considered by the investigative authorities. It's not right that it starts at the level of officials and goes down. It needs to cover the entire thing. Our sense, if you look at the fact that during the reign of Minister Mokonyane, irregular expenditure went up to 4 billion rand. We think that it's worth investigating all major contracts that were issued during that period. The other thing is that you can't have honest institutions if you don't have honest and ethical people. If we want the water sector to become an island of integrity, and I will come back to that, we need ethical leaders, and we need ethical leaders who will ensure that their appointments to organizations reinforce these values and appoint ethical people. We need processes in place to remove those who break the rules for corrupt processes. And we think that consideration should be given to the involvement of some kind of external agency, perhaps the Public Service Commission, panels constituted somehow that actually overlook the appointment of people to the boards of entities and ensure that the appropriate criteria are seriously being addressed in the appointment of those people to those positions, because those are extremely powerful and important positions in the water sector. If we look at procurement, we need to get the procurement under control. Major reform of the procurement system is not going to happen. It's not going to affect things where people are actually just ignoring the procurement processes and running things by informal rules. We have to get that process under control of the sense of impunity, and you can just do it how you like. But once we've got more of that under control, there are systems that have been used elsewhere that we can actually learn a lot from and can introduce. And part of that is the open contracting models, where participation from the private sector and civil society is actually invited to ensure improved accountability of government processes. And there's been some very interesting work done around the world in how one can actually do that. Open contracting models recognize that greater transparency from government, while a good thing, is not in itself sufficient, that actually the accountability based on that transparency is required. It needs that private sector is able to compete fairly, and that civil society actually is able to monitor and analyze public procurement processes. And some of the things that can be used in this process include integrity pacts. E-procurement is a big one. Data standards is a big one. And then red flag monitoring. And I mentioned earlier the issue of red flags. And one of the things we're saying is that we need to be able to say to ourselves, where there is rampant irregular expenditure, it should be a red flag. Is there corruption happening here? It may be that there isn't, but it may just be irregular for other reasons, but we need to be able to say there's rampant irregular expenditure in this institution that's happening. This is a red flag. We need to investigate whether there is actually corruption here. Similarly, where political appointees, ministers and boards of public agencies are involved in procurement decisions, who gets appointed, it should be a red flag. Is there corruption happening here? Then we need to work with the private sector. Is this still working? No, but you can still hear me. Cool. The notion that the private sector are a victim of corruption needs to be challenged. Private sector companies that enter into irregular contracts are breaking the law. They're placing their businesses at risk. They have a legal duty to ensure that correct procedures have been followed in the award of public contracts. They need to be made aware of that, and they need to be penalized when they actually benefit from being part of irregular processes. I have a suspicion the battery went flat. Then we're saying the work of the civil society and media needs to be recognized, it needs to be supported, it needs to be embraced. The role of media and the civil society in uncovering and publicizing corruption and then pursuing corruption until remedial action is taken is critically important. Part of that is the right of citizens and civil society to access information about public management processes, which needs to be respected and recognized, including information on procurement processes and regulatory decision making. Ideally, we would have a situation where our civil society organizations can actually spend their time on analyzing the information, not on having to put forward prior submissions to try and get the information out of government. The information should be freely available. The water sector already has extensive linkages with a range of civil society organizations, which have gone through their ups and downs over the years. But actually, there's a range of civil society bodies in the water sector that actually are interested, are passionate, and care, and they need to be supported and they need to be engaged. Apart from anything else, they have really important operational insights that don't necessarily come through from within the government structures. Then, and perhaps most importantly, we are saying the water sector is so important. We need to find ways that we can designate the water sector as an island of integrity, a no-go zone for corruption. People's lives depend on it. To be able to do that, we require joint work from government, from civil society, from the private sector. We need to bring people together around the table and say, we are going to make this sector an island of integrity. There's quite a useful model in relation to that that one can look at and maybe adapt, which is the model that is being used in the health sector, where there's an anti-corruption health forum, which is actually led by the SAU, brings a whole bunch of stakeholders together, law enforcement agencies, relevant government departments, representatives of the private sector, the regulators, civil society organizations who are involved in healthcare and involved in combating corruption, and they sit around the table to say, okay, what are we going to do about this issue? What are we going to do about this issue? Because what you need to do with different issues are different. So reports of corruption and gross irregularities are submitted to the forum and then allocated to the agency best placed to address them. It may well be worth bringing in the Auditor General into that process and some of the other Chapter 9 institutions. But we need to look at ways that we, as the water sector, can work together and say, not in our name, it stops. We want to designate the water sector as an island of integrity. It matters for people's lives. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barbara. Barbara, and I'd forgotten to mention, as Barbara, that a lot of the heavy lifting on the report was done by Mike Muller, who was previously the Director General of the Department of Water Affairs. And if Mike and Barbara could join us up here, we'll take questions and discussion from the floor. As you can see, this is a pretty comprehensive report, and
Right, we're coming out of the Corruption Watch report, talking about corruption specifically in the water sector.
Yeah, no doubt, the water sector is important. It's, people's lives depend on the water sector. So this is a report by Corruption Watch and the Water Integrity Network was aimed to, understand and integrate the drivers of corruption in the water sector. And it says, with regards to the broad political and economic challenges and the devastating social and economic impacts of corruption as it applies to water services and resources. We're going to have much more on that later.
What the reporter said, that corruption in the water sector is undermining the human right to water.
Correct.